Well, we've spoken several times with our friend Alam Bokhari, the senior tech correspondent at Breitbart.com, about how the big tech companies, ranging from the search engines like Google, YouTube's also a search engine, by the way, also owned by Google, and the rest of them, Twitter, Facebook, put their thumb on the scale and shifted potentially millions of votes away from Donald Trump towards Joe Biden. But that's not the only tilting of the playing field that happened. A new ebook written by Alam's colleague, our friend Joel Pollack, senior editor-at-large of Breitbart, makes the point. The new book, available out tomorrow, is called Neither Free Nor Fair, the 2020 U.S. Presidential Election. And joining us now to talk about what he means is our friend Joel Pollack. Joel, great to see you. Congratulations. You moved quickly. I see on Amazon, the book's a 178-page ebook. That's a lot of writing for just a few weeks. Tell me the different sections of your book. I see in your blurb, you say, even without voter fraud, which as of this writing remains unproven, the conditions of the election violated the free and fair standard. Putting aside voter fraud, tell me how this election was not fair.
Well, first of all, voter fraud happens during the voting. The voting is obviously the most important part of an election, but it is the last thing that happens aside from the counting. Voting and counting. Those are the last things that happen. An election is actually much longer than that. It's a process. And we judge the quality of an election based on the entire process, not just the polls and the counting. And if you look at the U.S. presidential election overall, there were several things that made it unfree and unfair. The most important of these was the widespread adoption of vote by mail at the behest of Democrats and over the objections of Republicans right in the middle of the election. So that made it unfair from the start. But there were other factors as well. One of them was political violence. We had widespread political violence in this country, largely carried out by the left and covered up or excused by the media. They say, well, only a small percentage of the Black Lives Matter protests were violent. Well, that's hundreds of riots, and they took place in 48 out of 50 large U.S. cities. So that had a definite impact, especially when you combine it with the cancel culture. 77% of Republicans reported they were afraid to share their political views. And if they did, they feared losing their jobs, they feared losing their security, they feared losing their social media accounts. So this is not an environment in which you can really conduct a free and fair election. Then you've got the censorship. And Alam talked about big tech intervening in the election through changing search algorithms and other kinds of interventions. But we saw it right out in the open with the Hunter Biden laptop story when Twitter and Facebook suppressed that story and suspended the New York Post, in Twitter's case, from using its own account for more than 2 weeks. Even people who shared the story, like Kayleigh McEnany, the press secretary for the President of the United States, she was locked out of her account. We've never seen anything like this in the history of American elections, or really at any other time other than war. You can think of maybe the Civil War and Abraham Lincoln imposing various kinds of censorship, martial law, that sort of thing, just to keep the country in line during a civil upheaval. But we've never seen anything quite like this. And you added a bunch of other factors. The fact that the Commission on Presidential Debates, for example, was slanted against Trump. One of the moderators conspired with one of Trump's most vociferous public opponents. All of this added together made the election unfree and unfair. Now, that doesn't mean we should throw out the results, because most of these things that happened were also legal. The abuses were legal. There are some exceptions, the violent riots and so forth, that was illegal, but you can argue that those were answered by their own backlash. There's significant evidence that voters, particularly Hispanic voters, pushed back against the whole defund the police movement and the riots by voting against Democrats, as did other voters. So in that sense, Democrats' failure to denounce the violence had a self-correcting feature in that voters turned out against Democrats. But other aspects of this could not be corrected. How do you correct the censorship? How do you correct the extreme media bias? How do you correct the Commission on Presidential Debates? Do you try to have other debates? I mean, this is a real problem. And we have a lot to do to fix our elections going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I remember we talked about this before, changing the rules of the game mid-game, and it explains so much about the pandemic mania. I mean, there was a period of time when the pandemic was deeply unknown, the risk was unknown, and anything was possible. That was March, April, May. But by the time November came around, and by the way, Black Lives Matter protests, every left-wing activist on the street sort of proved that even that side wasn't really taking the risk seriously. But if that was used as the premise to say, okay, we get to mail in votes now, all of a sudden the pandemic mania starts to make a lot more sense, not just to politically throw controversy at the president, to depress the economy, but to allow millions and millions of vote from home, vote by mail. I think you're right. Let me ask you, do you think that these problems exist for the Georgia senatorial runoffs? It couldn't be closer in the Senate, 2 seats up for grabs in Georgia. If the Democrats take it, they have the House, the Senate, and the presidency. They hint that they'll change everything, including the Supreme Court. Do you think some of the problems you've just outlined are at play in this crucial, crucial Georgia Senate runoff?
Yes, they are. There is evidence that tech companies, for example, are suppressing conservative news about the Georgia runoffs. Georgia also has a flawed election system that was made flawed by Democrats who sued the Georgia state government and obtained these ridiculous settlements. We call them consent decrees that imposed new rules on the voting. They made it almost impossible to check absentee ballots against the signatures on file for those voters. That's unconstitutional. There are also many ways in which private actors are investing in Georgia to help Democratic counties turn out the vote. That's unfair, probably illegal, and also unconstitutional. All these things are still in place. Plus, you have the conviction among many Republican voters that the election is rigged, and that's going to depress turnout. I mean, whether you want to boycott the vote to send a message, which is a terrible idea, but some people have talked about it, or you want to vote to send a message that you don't stand for voter fraud, this question of whether the election was fair or not really hangs over everything. Now, people are focused on the Dominion voting machines and some of these other challenges, ballots in suitcases under tables. I think that's a way of talking about a real problem with examples that might not actually pan out. I think the real problem is that the election was unfree and unfair, and the way people are expressing that is by focusing on specific examples that they believe to have been abused or cases of abuse. But I think that the fact that Republicans are convinced the election was rigged in November is definitely a disadvantage heading into the January 5th runoffs.
Well, Joel, listen, I'm thrilled that you've got this book out so quickly. Folks, it goes on sale tomorrow as an ebook. You can get it at Amazon. We'll have the link below this story. Very exciting, very nerve-wracking. I'm very nervous about Georgia, and I'm not even an American. My God, if the Democrats have all 3 levels, the White House, the Senate, and the House, I think our world is going to change up here in Canada, not just in the States. Joel Pollack, good, congratulations. The book is called Neither Free Nor Fair. I can hardly wait to read it myself.
Thank you, Ezra. Thanks for the opportunity.
All right, all the best.